I'll go up there.
Please.
All right. Ready? Okay. Okay.
Oh, don't swap out.
No,
They'll
no.
sell.
Yeah. That's
So,
right.
don't worry. Don't worry.
Yeah.
Let's just go ahead and sit up here.
Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Patrick Spiro, and I'm the Executive Director of the George Washington Presidential Library, and I'm thrilled to be here. I'm even more thrilled to see so many people coming out on a Friday night at 7 o'clock. So thank you all for coming. I just want to make a couple quick housekeeping announcements before we turn it over to the main event. A couple of events that are happening here at Mount Vernon that I hope you all will put into your calendars. The first is from November 2nd to the 4th. Mount Vernon is organizing a major symposium on democracy in America. It's called The Great Experiment, Democracy from the Founding to the Future. And the symposium is bringing leaders in a number of different areas of American life to talk about the past, present, and future of democracy. We have many Pulitzer Prize-winning historians who are going to talk about the founders, but also the role of history in our democracy. We have federal judges and legal scholars talking about the Constitution. We have journalists who are talking about the role of the media in America. And education leaders. We have secretaries of education, we have university presidents and the like. So I hope you all might think about joining us in this conversation, November 2nd to the 4th. And if you can't join us in person, there is an online option. So please check that out. I also want to mention our next Ford Evening Book Talk is next Thursday, October the 26th. It's a wonderful book by a fellow that conducted their research here. It's called The First Family, George Washington's Heirs and the Making of America. So it's a very Mount Vernon story, and I hope you all will join us on October the 26th for that. And then finally, one of the things that we're doing here is reinstituting a lunch hour, a lunch and learn here. And our first one's going to be November the 8th. It's going to be done by a Marine Corps Major General who just wrote a new book on Washington's Marines that's about the origins of the Marines. So that's November the 8th, and information on that lunchtime talk is online. So with all that out of the way, it is my great honor and pleasure to introduce our two distinguished guests tonight. The first one is General David Petraeus, who I'm sure everybody here is familiar with, having been the only person in uniform to throw out the first pitch in a World Series game and to do a coin toss in the Super Bowl. I think he's also done a few other things along the way, including serving for 37 years in the U.S. Army, having 6 consecutive commands, 5 of which were battlefield and combat commands. Serving as the director of the CIA, getting appointed 94-0 by the Senate, and now today taking a leading position in the world of finance as a partner at KKR and overseeing their global institute. And he's joined by his co-author, and I can't wait to have a conversation to hear about how they work together as authors, by Lord Andrew Roberts, who is a member of the House of Lords. And I was thinking about this earlier. How remarkable is it that we have an American general and a member of the House of Lords here at Mount Vernon tonight who work together on a history of warfare? Now, Andrew has written or edited 19 books, and when I showed him his biography, he said, "You can't tell him everything." So I'll just highlight a few because it's a remarkable range of work that he's done, often studying some of the great leaders who have shaped our world. It includes The Storm of War, A New History of the Second World War, Masters and Commanders, How 4 Titans Won the War in the West, 1941 to 1945, Waterloo, Napoleon's Last Gamble, and Napoleon, A Life. And then 2 books that I'm very familiar with, Churchill, Walking with Destiny, which won a number of awards, and most recently, The Last King of America, The Misunderstood Reign of George III, that I recommend to everybody here. So with that, let's begin this conversation. And Bert, can you all hear me? Okay, great. So I had the great pleasure of reading this book. It arrived on my desk yesterday morning. I don't know if Megan's here with me. She dropped it off, and I said, I don't know if I'm going to be able to read it. And I did not read it closely, but I read it all. There may have been a couple paragraphs and pages skipped, but it's a remarkable overview of the history of warfare after World War II. And to begin, before we dive into this book itself, I was just wondering how you two got to know each other and why you decided to write this book.
It was after the invasion, immediately after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that I got on to David and said that what I think people would like to have is a military history book to look at the war, the Russo-Ukrainian war, in terms of military history, rather than in terms of geopolitics or politics. And he jumped at the idea. And so we got HarperCollins, the publishers, and they said, how are you going to divvy up the chapters? And I said, well, David's going to write about all the countries he's invaded. And I'm going to, and he also did the Vietnam War chapter, which obviously is a crucial one for the evolution of warfare. And I was going to fit in the rest. So we then sent the chapters backwards and forwards to one another, and the whole thing has been a profoundly satisfying intellectual experience.
We don't remember where we actually met, but we've known each other for a number of years, and we've done a lot of events together over those years. For example, the Churchill book alone, which is very much the best single-volume biography of Churchill by far. I interviewed him at the New York Historical Society. I do a number of those there each year, and then the 92nd Street Y, another one of the major intellectual locations in New York City. And that led to 4 more, actually, because we had so much fun doing the overall book that he said, why don't we do Churchill and the military? Great. Churchill and the intelligence. Churchill and the royal family. And then Churchill and his buddies, basically. It was a little bit more descriptive than that, and which was just delightful. I mean, about how Churchill formed his own new club. What was it called again? The other club. And it was all his buddies, basically. And they did get together regularly, all the time, even during the war years and so forth. So, and then he invited me a couple of times. He's the co-founder of the Cliveden Literary Festival, one of the great festivals over there in England. And I hadn't written a book, but he said, come on over anyway, I'll interview you and it'll fill the tent or whatever. And it did, and that was great fun. We just did that a couple of weeks ago, and with having now actually written a book, which was even more special, needless to say, and it filled it, sold it out, and we did the other literary festivals as well. We also did something with the George III book, and we did this in the Army Museum in London. Somebody there had asked me to help raise money for the Army Benevolent Fund, and since I had Brits under me in command in 2 different wars, and actually all 5 of these combat commands were always British in the structure. Usually my deputy was always British. So we embarked on that, and I said, you know what? We'll help you sell that book, of course. It's always all about book sales. But I said, why don't you ask me the question that we dig into? It starts out, could the British have won the American Revolutionary War? The answer to that is yes, if they'd had a competent civil military counterinsurgency campaign, which they didn't. So we had a lot of fun with that as well. And I've also been in innumerable. I mean, it was a close run affair if you go back. I mean, had they trapped him in Manhattan, that might have been a different war. But I've also, we've had a lot of fun in various other ways over the years. He's invited me to be the guest of honor at this beautiful townhouse that he has, you know, the classic white townhouse. And he is Baron Roberts of Belgravia, and some of you will understand it's a particularly needy constituency. The problem is that about 1/3 of them haven't actually been back to their beautiful townhouses in Belgravia because they're sort of stuck in Moscow since the Russians invaded Ukraine. But anyway, it's been a delightful relationship over the years, and we had a lot of fun writing this. We did it in less than a year in the end, actually, which is a relatively quick, which is how quickly we also did the Counterinsurgency Field Manual when I was a 3-star between the 3- and 4-star tours in Iraq.
You know, I was struck by how quick this book must have been written, and I was interested in the process. But you also developed, or you have developed, and you really highlighted in this book, a model for strategic leadership. And I don't know if you all could share with us what both your study of the past, and not only your study of the past, but your practice of leadership, maybe has developed this model.
So I actually had an explicit intellectual construct for the exercise of strategic leadership. So this is the leader at the very top of an organization. And actually distilled it at Harvard. I was a fellow up there for 6 years, non-resident. I've had a lot of academic assignments over the years. I did a PhD in Princeton. My dissertation was on the American military and the lessons of Vietnam. So I'd actually distilled this with a group of graduate students, and it's at the belfercenter.org if you want to go look. It's an actual website. And I used it explicitly during the surge in Iraq and in all the subsequent four-star commands and then the CIA, where you really are the leader at the top of an organization. We went through the book, and we came to the conclusion that the biggest common factor that determines success or failure in a war is the quality of the strategic leadership on either side. And we decided to go back to the introduction. You'll see that we very explicitly lay out the tasks of a strategic leader, which are four. You have to get the big ideas right. You get the overarching strategy. You have to really understand the nature of the war, the strengths and weaknesses of your forces, the enemy forces, the physical terrain, the human terrain, all of this. You have to really have a deep understanding and then craft the right big ideas, the right strategy. You have to communicate the big ideas effectively through the breadth and depth of your organization. Now, if it's a president, by the way, and usually you have a civilian strategic leader and then the leader in the field, if it's a president, he has to do it to a country and really to everyone else who has an interest, a stake in the outcome of that particular conflict. Then you have to oversee the implementation of the big ideas. This is what we normally think of as leadership. It's the example you provide, the energy, the inspiration, attracting great people, keeping them, developing them, allowing those who aren't measuring up to move on to something else. It's very importantly how you spend your time, because nothing shows importance more than that you're actually there, you're devoted to this, and it's the frequency of the meetings and the recurring nature of those and all the rest of that. So we had events we did every single day of the week, 7 days a week in combat, and then 2 days a week at least we would go out to see soldiers. We'd actually go on a patrol with them right after that morning meeting. Again, there's a whole rhythm of these different activities. And then the metrics that you're using. It's very important to have the right metrics, and they have to be very rigorously developed. They can't be like the body count in Vietnam, which over time was lacking in integrity, and it really undermined the integrity in the entire effort. But it was also the wrong metric, frankly. It should have been a metric that had much more to do about securing the Vietnamese people, their hamlets, their villages, their districts, provinces, and so forth. And then you have the fourth task that's often overlooked, which is you have to determine how you need to refine the big ideas and do it again. And by the way, that the events connected with that force you, we used to call them action forcing mechanisms, have to be on your battle rhythm. And, there's once a week the strategic planners would confront me and say, okay, boss, if you want to be here by then, you got to start issuing some orders and making some decisions. You can't stall any longer. By the way, we used to do those sessions in the morning so you weren't tired, as opposed to the afternoon where, you're not quite as sharp. And I'm not joking, because again, it's 115 degrees in Baghdad, and there's a 25-knot wind blowing in your face. So again, that's the construct for this. And then we went back through the chapters again and sharpened our examination of the quality of the strategic leaders that we were examining in these different chapters. And there's a couple of really delightful, actually there's a number of ones, but you might talk about a couple that we found particularly enjoyable.
Of counterinsurgency
Yeah.
campaigns. Well, there was one that took place in Oman, where there was a communist insurgency in Dhofar, and it was defeated by a combination of the new Sultan, young, he was in his 20s, he'd been to Sandhurst. You've got a view about Sandhurst.
Well, the international students that go to Sandhurst are taught how to overthrow their father when they go home.
Yeah.
and he did.
He did. And by the way, his father deserved to be overthrown. His father was the most extraordinary reactionary who set his face against any kind of progress or modernity whatsoever. He banned trousers. He banned transistor radios. He banned dolls. He banned gas cookers and any kind of advances, medical, educational, agricultural, and so on. And so when he was overthrown, the Sultan Qaboos, his son, was able to offer something positive to the people, and that also, and he had with him working the British Brigadier Sir John Akehurst. They got on tremendously well. It was the classic example of civil military authorities working well with one another, and they fought. It was a long campaign from the late 1960s to 1975. fought and defeated this very serious communist insurgency. And they used a lot of the methods that had already been pioneered by Sir Gerald Templar in Malaya. The Malaysian emergency of 1952 to 60 was won in part by the phrase hearts and minds comes from Sir Gerald Templar. It won by winning the hearts and minds of the Malaysian people against their communist uprising, by, again, offering independence for Malaya, which happened in 1957, and also putting together this very proactive counterinsurgency campaign, which was later, some of the lessons from it were picked up and quoted in David's counterinsurgency manual of 2006.
There's a little postscript to this, or footnote, and that is that Brigadier John Akehurst, as only a Brit could, writes a book and titles it, "We Won a War." And I loved the book, actually. I'd read it, and so when I was writing speeches for the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, who was the deputy, but General Sir John Akehurst by then, and I remember taking my copy in and asking if you'd be so kind to inscribe it, which he was. And again, just another one of the quintessentially Brit things. You know, if I wrote a book like that, my West Point classmates would laugh me off the stage. But in the UK, you can get away with it, or in England.
So when I was reading the book, I was trying to figure out who was writing what. Now, a few times it becomes memoir-esque, where you refer to the first.
Well, Iraq and Afghanistan, what we sent in, we did it all third person, and we shipped it off to the editor, and he came back and said, "This just doesn't work. You can't say," and then General Petraeus went to see the Prime Minister and, raised these issues with him, and the Prime Minister said to General Petraeus, he said, "Write Iraq and Afghanistan in the first person, and we'll put a little note right underneath the chapter heading that says, given his service there." Because you remember, I was present for the invasion as a 2-star. I come home after a year commanding the 101st Airborne Division. I'm sent back pretty quickly by Secretary Rumsfeld, do an assessment. Things had gone poorly in something. I came back, gave him a bunch of recommendations. He said, "These are terrific. Go over and implement them." So I go back as a 3-star. Did that for 15 and a half months. By the way, came home through Afghanistan to look at that for him. Had the one non-combat command, but that's where we did the counterinsurgency field manual and overhauled all the preparation of our commissioned, non-commissioned warrant officers for this, as well as materiel requirements, training center rotations, and so forth. Then went back, commanded the surge, 19 and a half months, and then actually went to Central Command, where I was the commander of the commander in Iraq, because it was a straight U.S. chain of command, and eventually ended up, as we were pulling our final combat troops out, I was by then the director of the CIA, and it was a fairly unique vantage point. So it made a lot of sense. And but of course, as the Wall Street Journal review said, one of Andrew's many contributions to this book was
to soften your hard edges.
the hard edges of Petraeus's prose, or something like that. Yeah.
But one of the stories that came out to me were the ones that I didn't know about, and Borneo was one of those. It actually plays a fairly significant role in here, and there's a figure in there. I remember, was it Walter Walker?
Yes, yeah.
Who actually proved to have a great leadership style.
Yes, well, he did. General Sir Walter Walker certainly did. But the fascinating thing about the Borneo confrontation, it's called, is that the entire war was conducted in secret on both sides. The Indonesians didn't want anyone to know about it because they were losing, and also they felt that it would be bad for the stability of the regime. And the British Commonwealth and British didn't want anyone to know about it because we were doing patrols across the border, essentially violating the sovereignty of Indonesia. So in the days before cell phones, it was possible to conduct an entire war in secret. And something that would be completely impossible to conceive of now. But it was successful, and the Indonesians were ultimately, it was again a long war, defeated.
So when did people find out, and what did they do?
They didn't find out for a very long time because they didn't have any embedded journalists. We didn't allow any journalists at all into Borneo in that period. And so they only found out once the war was over.
Yeah. great. One of the,
Unlike when I went to war in the fight to Baghdad, and I had Rick Atkinson. Actually, nobody you
Oh,
will
yeah.
know because he did the Revolutionary War. He's working on that trilogy. And that was where I sort of fatefully said, I could see the assumptions that we'd been provided before the fight to Baghdad being invalidated one by one. And I asked rhetorically, tell me how this ends. And boy, did I ever hear that again and again and again. It was even a title of a book, Tell Me How This Ends. But we actually did determine how it would end. At least it ended for a period of time, and that was with the surge in Iraq.
Yeah.
And by the way, strategic leadership, we got the big ideas right. By the way, you talk about change leadership. It doesn't get any bigger than completely reversing what you've been doing before over the objection of the prime minister of the country you're trying to help pull out of a civil war. But, and then we communicated in every which way, even my personal counterinsurgency guidance to all the troops, the battle rhythm, all these overseeing the implementation, and then constantly doing again, reviewing to determine how we need to refine it and adapt it and do it again and again and again.
Yeah, and you chose to dedicate a whole chapter to Vietnam, and I can understand why, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about your perspective on Vietnam. In particular, the part that I was most struck by was something that I think it was a General Palmer noted afterwards, in which he said, we may have lost Vietnam, but from a geopolitical point of view, the 10 years we spent in Vietnam actually improved our battle against communism.
Yeah, I think it's a reasonable argument. And because he was so forthright in his assessment of the war and the mistakes we made, frankly, I think it carried a good bit of weight. Henry Kissinger actually shared the same view. Perhaps most importantly, Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, the great man, really the extraordinary leader who brought Singapore from a backward nation to the extraordinary country that it is today. In fact, his son is the Prime Minister now and is of just about equal quality. But Lee Kuan Yew actually said that this really protected the development of all of the other countries that might have fallen under the yoke of communism had it not been for that. But the fact was, again, you look at strategic leadership, we didn't get it right there. We arguably didn't get it right until 1968, noting that we went in there originally after the French had their catastrophe at Dien Bien Phu. By the way, talk about a big idea. The French generals were frustrated. They couldn't get the communists to join them in battle. They were very elusive. They were fighting as guerrillas. It was very difficult. So they sought to bring them to battle, and they figured out the way they could do that is to establish a base way out into the hinterlands, quite a way for air cover and everything else. And it was Dien Bien Phu, and they built this huge base. By the way, as only the French could. The little outlying outposts were named for the mistresses of the French commander. I think there were 5 of them. And then, by God, they brought the French to battle. But of course, the French defeated, or the Viet Minh at that time, the communists defeated them. They had to surrender eventually. Went into captivity for a period of time, and then there was an agreement at Geneva, which separated North and South Vietnam and so forth, and they left in ignominious defeat. We came in, the Vietnamese, South Vietnamese said, our problem is in the villages and the hamlets. What we need is essentially a counterinsurgency campaign. The American advisors, we had the money and the equipment, said, no, we've just been fighting in Korea. Let us tell you what you need, and what you need are divisions that are like our army divisions, because the real threat is the North Vietnamese attacking across the demilitarized zone. And so we built big divisions, and we never really devoted the attention to the villages and the hamlets, which is where the people were, of course, and counterinsurgency is all about securing and serving the people. That's the big idea, number one. And you can only do that by living with them. And that was not done effectively. There were programs for it. There was the Strategic Hamlet program, but it turned out that they were never really focused on in a rigorous manner, and often there was a lack of integrity in the reports that were coming up to the headquarters as well. So it really wasn't until 1968, when General Abrams replaced General Westmoreland, that you actually had finally the kind of comprehensive civil military counterinsurgency campaign that had been needed all along. And then by then, of course, domestic political public opinion in the U.S. had eroded to such a point that it was no longer possible to carry that. And it's a tragedy, because you had the right general. You also by then had the right president and national security advisor. Nixon and Kissinger. In fact, we were at a lunch several days ago in New York in a townhouse almost as nice as Andrew's in Belgravia that was attended by Henry Kissinger, also Fareed Zakaria and former Treasury Secretary and some others. And we had a very interesting conversation with him, in that case not about Vietnam, which I've done with him before, but about the difference between the Yom Kippur War, which we recount here, the 1973 war where Egypt crossed the Suez, caught the Israelis completely by surprise, achieved catastrophic success, and it was catastrophic because they weren't prepared for it and they didn't exploit it. But there was a real existential moment there for Israel at that moment in time. Then they regrouped, heroic, really extraordinary initiative, counteroffensive, and the tanks are on, Israeli tanks, are on the road to Cairo with the 3rd Egyptian army was encircled. And then Henry Kissinger brokered a ceasefire. But then eventually, of course, as Henry noted, I could call 4 people and we could stitch this all up. Now, it's not as easy as that. He was flying all over and lots of drama and brinksmanship and everything else. But at the end of the day, Anwar Sadat of Egypt wanted to get some kind of agreement with Israel that would be durable. He wanted to get the Sinai back. Golda Meir was open to that. And he also could call King Hussein and Hafiz al-Assad in Damascus. So basically there's 4 people you call and you can bring this to a close and have something that could be of enduring value, and it was. And you look at the situation now in Gaza, I mean, who do you call in Gaza? You call the leader of Hamas, an organization whose founding documents are sworn to the destruction of Israel and killing of Jews, especially after having experienced what they did 2 weeks ago on Saturday. So the differences are really extraordinary. And plus, a battle in Gaza City will be not the antiseptic out in the desert tank on tank. This is enemy that doesn't wear uniforms. It's not an army in that sense. It fights among the people. It has over 200 hostages. Think about the numbers here, by the way. The killing of 1,300 Israelis. Remember, we lost 3,000 people on 9/11, just about. 1,300 per capita for us, given the size of Israel, would be well over 40,000. And the 200 hostages would be 5,000 roughly. So again, to give the sense of the trauma that they have experienced, I think you have to put it into terms that we might understand.
That's great.
Very different situation, though, from 73.
Now, Andrew, I realize that the French had a much different style of decolonization that comes out in this book. And I now know who probably wrote that section. So can you tell us a little bit about how the French approached decolonization? That also had a big impact, as the general was speaking, into our entrance into Vietnam.
Well, they tended not to think that it was a good idea. This was the key thing. Obviously in Indochina, as David's mentioned, but also in Algeria, where they fought for as long as possible to try to hold on to Algeria. By contrast, the British Empire from 1947 onwards and the transfer of power in India essentially undermined the whole of the concept of empire, and we were pretty much out of everywhere by 1960. Whereas the French were determined to hang on. And one of the things that they did in Algeria, which was so disastrous for them ultimately, was to indulge in the use of torture. And this was approved at the top level. General Massu, who was governor of Algeria and also the commander of French forces there, overtly accepted that that this would be used. It was part of a sort of official policy. And what it did was essentially to go against the concept of the French Republic, which was founded in 1789 on the Declaration of the Rights of Man. And it also, so it created domestic opposition to French rule in Algeria on a sort of, on a moral level. But also, of course, it didn't provide the kind of information that was needed operationally anyway, because people essentially will tell anybody who's torturing them anything that they think that they want to know. And so these two things came together to wind up essentially undermining the French position in Algeria rather than promoting it.
What is interesting, though, there were some people that got Algeria right. There was a very famous individual at a lower, much lower level, who wrote Galula, who wrote a very good book on that, and we actually did use that when we were developing the field manual. We also used the bad examples, and again, torture, enhanced interrogation techniques. Number one, and I stood against these from the very beginning in Iraq when all of a sudden we had detainees and we didn't know what to do with them. And there was nowhere we could push them up. They hadn't thought that size of the problem through. And we decided, let's just use the Geneva Convention. We've trained on this all along. And perhaps understandably a bit because of the trauma of 9/11 and an expectation that there was a strategic ticking time bomb out there, that there was something worse coming. People took those expedient methods. But, of course, with hindsight, number one, it revalidated the old idea that they really don't work. You can get people to talk, but they won't necessarily give you something valuable. And the second is, even if you got something valuable, it's probably not worth the cost incurred in the court of public opinion because you resorted to those. So, again, we've learned some lessons the hard way, a number of lessons the hard way in the post 9/11 wars.
Yeah, well, speaking of learning, that's actually the question I really wanted to ask you both, which is, whenever you write a book, at least in my experience, you learn something new, something maybe you didn't expect. So, Andrew, I'd love to hear what maybe you learned writing this book, or maybe how your perspective on the past changed.
Well, firstly, very much this concept that David was talking about at the beginning of strategic leadership, and quite how important that is. And you go to wars like the Chinese Civil War, the Korean War, and so on, right the way up to the present day, and see the way in which that really does matter. And secondly, we have the last chapter of the book called The Future of War, where we look at cyber and space and sensors and drones and AI, robotics, all these various areas which are obviously going to be important in any future war. And we try and see, well, the classic example, of course, being the war in Ukraine, where a lot of these are being used in a very positive way by the immensely innovative Ukrainians. And to try and work out to what extent would that mean that a future war would look like Ukraine. And in some areas we considered that it does, and in others that it didn't.
Yeah.
What about yourself? Did your thoughts change, perspective?
Again, it really drove home the importance of strategic leadership. I thought it was very important. I'd actually exercised it. I'd used that. But then when we look back through that prism, you realize, again, my examination of Vietnam was for the PhD was 10 years after the war. Didn't have all the additional scholarship, declassification of records. Individuals were still somewhat misrepresenting what they were actually doing and so on. And I was much more seized with the lessons the military took, whether they were the right lessons or not. I was trying to understand my institution and how these lessons influenced the institution, particularly when it came to advice on our most important task, which is the use of force with the president. It turned out it was very instructive because I was later an aide to the Chief of Staff of the Army during 2 wars. I was the exec to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff when we did Bosnia and Kosovo and a number of others, and actually was very instructive in that regard. But that, going back and looking at Vietnam and realizing, wow, we really did not get the big ideas right, and how serious a deficiency that was. And then looking at some of these others as well, and if you look through that prism, it's pretty clear why something didn't go well. You can also have a situation that is so diabolically difficult, and Vietnam may have been that way. It's possible you could have done everything right in Vietnam, and the quality of our partners was so lacking. Keep in mind that the leaders of Vietnam were really disconnected from the people. They literally spoke French, not the local language. They were Catholics, not Buddhists. They went shopping in Paris, not in the little district place. And so the connectivity between them and the peasants, if you will, which is the bulk of the population, was not particularly strong. There was also a lot of corruption. There were a lot of other challenges. And Afghanistan, in some respects, had some of these. In fact, at one point, Secretary Rumsfeld asked me to look at Afghanistan on the way home from the three-star tour in Iraq, and I came back and I told him this is going to be the longest of the long wars. And you don't realize it because the level of violence is so relatively low compared with Iraq, but let me lay out the factors, the objective reality in Afghanistan, and I think you're going to realize that this is going to be really, really tough. And oh, by the way, we haven't been devoting enough attention to it. But the sanctuaries that were allowed by Pakistan for the Taliban and the other major insurgent group, the Haqqani, on their soil, they wouldn't do anything about it, and they also wouldn't let us do much about it either. That was a crippling deficiency. It was really very, very serious. That doesn't mean that you couldn't have something that was unsatisfactory, but a lot better than what has transpired. I personally believe that we should have stayed in Afghanistan, 3,500 troops when you haven't lost a soldier in 18 months, $25 billion a year out of a budget of $800 billion. We can afford that. And I felt very strongly that what would follow, that we would regret the decision to withdraw. And I certainly hope that we do, because the outcome, I think, has not just been heartbreaking and tragic, it's been disastrous. And I think it actually influenced President Putin into thinking, you know what, look at that. They didn't even have the strategic patience to keep 3,500 troops in the ground, having not lost one in again, a year and a half. Not that costly. They're not going to do much if I invade Ukraine. That was one of his many, many miscalculations about, his, again, compare and contrast the strategic leader of Zelensky gets the big ideas right. I don't want a ride. I want ammunition. I'm staying in Kyiv. My family's going to stay in Kyiv. We're going to defend Kyiv. All men are going to stay in Ukraine. Beautiful communication skills. After all, he was an actor. Then he became a comedian. He played the president so successfully that they made him the president. What was it, the servant of the people party or something? It's just classic. It's really, really great. And then his personal example. He changes from a suit into an OD green sweatshirt with the emblem of the Armed Forces of Ukraine on it. Just a really master class, I think, in strategic leadership, although it's still an uncertain outcome, although they did win the Battle of Kyiv, Sumy, Chernihiv, Kharkiv Oblast, Kherson, west of the Dnipro, but it's a pretty tough slog down in the south, where the defenses that the Russians were able to put in are very, very formidable. But then you contrast that with Putin. He totally underestimates how the Ukrainians will respond. He overestimates the capabilities of his forces. He doesn't appreciate how strong the U.S., European, and Western response will be. And so, again, his example, he sits at the end of a long table. All the minions are way down there. You almost have to have a microphone to be heard from one end to the other. Very rarely visits the front lines, and so forth. So, again, that's the learning is it's all about strategic leadership. And we can put that into context for you if you want during the Q&A on the situation that faces Israel right now.
Yeah, no, that's great. Your comment reminded me of actually George Washington, because there's two stories when you were talking about Zelensky that I was reminded of. The first is we have a letter here in our vault in which George Washington is writing to the overseer of Mount Vernon in 1775. He says it's really important that you keep Mount Vernon going as a farm, because it's really important that I show that I believe in the future. And if you let Mount Vernon go fallow, what does that mean about my own leadership? And the other one is actually something that John Adams said very snidely, which was very Adams-like, about George Washington. He referred to him as the greatest actor the presidency has ever seen.
You have to act as a strategic leader.
Yeah, and he meant to denigrate him, but Adams was, of course, the first failed president, and it was clearly that he didn't understand leadership.
No, you have to do that. Look, at a certain point, I think it was about the 5-month mark in the surge in Iraq, I decided I'm not going to wear a Kevlar helmet anymore. I'm going to put on a soft guy. I still wore body armor. I didn't want to get a body shot. I'd been shot once already through the chest. I didn't want to repeat that. But, you have to do some of that. You have to perform. There is performative art that's part of this. In fact, sometimes when we were going to meet with the prime minister, the ambassador and I always went together. And on the way there would be in one of these armored SUVs, and I'd have my translator there as well, because I'm going to discuss with him what we're going to talk about. And I would say, okay, today I'm going to show the full range of emotions. You just keep translating, because what it would be is, so the prime minister would sit here, the translator would there, but back a bit to show that he's not the principal. And then I'd be sitting there. If it was my meeting, if it was the ambassadors, he'd sit there and sometimes it'd swap places. But I tell the translator that if you think I'm actually losing it, and you can lose, this is life and death. We're losing soldiers. We're arguing with the prime minister over very important issues. And occasionally, again, I'd show the full range of emotions, but I'd get so emotional in acting that all of a sudden I am starting, and you have to be really careful that you don't say something that is non-biodegradable. It never goes away. And so my translator was told he would pluck my sleeve, and that would remind me, get back into acting mode, not emotional mode. But that's part of leadership. You have to do that. I remember a great story about Robert E. Lee. It's right at the end. He's being chased by Grant. It's almost at Appomattox. His army is starving, and he's been told that there's a rail car and a siding up ahead that has food in it. Because again, they're really they've long since eaten their last rations. And he rides over on Traveler. He throws the door open on the train, and he looks inside, and it's ammunition. But you can't let your shoulders slump, and he doesn't. And he turns around and rides back, and again sends that message. Or Grant, we were talking about earlier, the bloody Battle of Shiloh. On the first day, they've had almost been driven back into the Tennessee River. It was the worst day Sherman and he ever had. It's raining. He's got his slouch hat on. The rain's dripping off. He's got a stub of a cigar. He can hear the cries of the wounded on the battlefield, the cries of those having their limbs amputated. And Sherman comes out of the dark and he says, "Well, Grant, we had the devil's own day today, didn't we?" And Grant says, "Yep, lick 'em tomorrow, though." Actually, he wasn't acting. He just had that indomitable will. But if you don't have that, you got to act like you do. And I told that story during the surge in Iraq, and it became a rallying cry: "Lick 'em tomorrow," because we had some really, really tough days, and you had to have the fortitude and the conviction that we were going to be able to prevail, and we did.
That's great. We mentioned Q&A, and I want to make sure
Yes,
everybody has
let's
a chance
go.
to ask. And
Let them have it.
2 pages of questions that I'm going to have to pass over. So I think, and while that microphone, please raise your hand. We have a microphone, and they'll bring it to you. And while we get that set up, one of the things
Right
that
over
you all write about is Ukraine, and you talk about how Putin has not adapted since World War II, that he's using World War II style tactics. Why do you think that is?
Part of it is just the doctrine that they have. Part of it is the equipment that they have. I think that's a little bit of a
Simplification.
because they have used their hypersonic weapons. They have used advanced. But again, part of it is just that's the battlefield that you have. Actually, the characterization I like, which is the accurate characterization of the battlefield in Ukraine, is that from Max Boot of the Washington Post, which is that this is where All Quiet on the Western Front meets Blade Runner. Because you have, World War I, All Quiet on the Western Front, trenches and barbed wire. You have World War II and Cold War vintage armored systems, the same ones that we were preparing to defend Western Germany with. And then you have drones that are really quite advanced. And then you have a transparency on this battlefield that is totally unprecedented. We've never had a battlefield before where everyone has a smartphone, internet access, and social media platforms onto which they can upload videos and so forth. But please.
Hang on, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
If I could just add, one of the other takeaways of this book is that warfare is not linear. That it does evolve, but it doesn't evolve. It evolves in fits and starts. Sometimes it can be sidelined and sort of sidetracked, and it essentially can reverse, which is what happened in the Iran-Iraq war of the 1980s, where nearly 2 million people were killed, and all of the key, and there was no great strategic leadership on either side, which was one of the reasons it did go on for so long, and so many people died. And you see gas and trenches and barbed wire, which is essentially reminiscent of a war that ended 70 years before that one.
So first, thanks to both of you for...
Hey, Jim, how are you? I didn't see you in the dark. This is a Lieutenant
Yes,
General
everybody-
retired right here, and a great fellow traveler. He was the commander of the Multinational Security Transition Command in Iraq during the surge, and it was a privilege to have him as a teammate.
That was mine, but...
He also has a PhD.
You named the book Conflict, not War. And I wondered what was your discussion to come to conflict and what you're trying to tell us, the readers, by the choice you made.
Well, it's because we also brought in some some things that were conflicts as much as they were wars. Especially the Malayan emergency that I mentioned earlier, the Oman Dhofar uprising. We didn't want to sort of essentially dignify the communist uprising with a title war, because it was within a country, and that was ultimately the reason we wanted to cover the whole gamut: big wars, small wars, desert wars, jungle wars, wars across borders and within countries. So we thought that would be a better explanation.
But we didn't cover all wars either during that period. We sort of cut off Iraq at 2011, sort of summarized very briefly how the Islamic State was able to reform and how we had to respond. We didn't do the Troubles, interestingly. I thought Andrew might, in Northern Ireland.
It was very much, we chose the ones that seemed to display how war was changing and how war was evolving.
Other questions, please.
One of the remarkable facts, and I might have this slightly wrong, did you say that 50 million people have been killed in conflicts after World War II?
I can't remember.
Okay. It was some astronomical number.
It's a huge number.
Yeah.
We did. Actually, it was 2 million in Iran, Iraq alone, just
Yeah.
as an example. So,
And
yep.
6 million in the Chinese Civil War.
Yes. Yeah.
Good
Please.
evening, gentlemen. My question is about hybrid warfare, and you do a very good job of pulling the thread through the entire book about Gerasimov's doctrine.
How's that worked out? So Gerasimov is the chief of the general staff of Russia. Everyone thought he was a genius when he took over Crimea and the southeastern part of Ukraine without really many shots fired, although ultimately the southeast piece was a very, very substantial war. And he wrote about hybrid warfare, and again, it was hugely admired. But
Yes, sir. My question is, for the future of warfare, do you see more information and hybrid warfare, and how do you think that the United States will fare in that realm?
I think the future of war will be in all domains simultaneously, so it'll be multi-domain, and that includes, therefore, not just ground, air, sea, subsea, outer space, cyberspace. And actually, in fact, Max Boot-again in the column the other day, he said it in their great book, Conflict, they described the different domains, and perhaps we should add an additional domain, which is the one I think that you're probably suggesting, which is the information domain. It's hugely important. We spent a great deal of time on that during the surge in Iraq. As General Dubik will recall, we had a whole media, it was as if we were running a political campaign. We had media monitoring and all the media that existed. Our big idea, you have to have big ideas for everything. The big idea for dealing with the press was to be first with the truth. Try to beat the bad guys to the headline, but do it with the truth as you best understand it at the time. And again, when we would see something, or when the team would see something, or hear something, or whatever, or read something in the media, such as it was in 2007, 2008, we responded immediately. You have to very rapidly do that. The challenge is now, though, obviously, with social media platforms, so much that is online, the proliferation of news channels, then the challenge of news channels that are more aligned with one party than the other, and vice versa. All of this has made this vastly more difficult, and we really have to come to grips with that. We saw in the past 48 hours, of course, what can happen when an inaccurate report is put out. Of course, the accusation by Hamas that the Israelis had bombed a hospital and killed, how many did the original say? It was hundreds.
They started off with 500, and
Yeah.
then they put it up to 1,000.
And it actually was 20, number one. And then number two, it turns out when they rewound the tape, basically, of all the different intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance systems that can show you where something emanated from, that it was actually an Islamic Jihad rocket that didn't fully ignite, and instead of landing in Israel, it landed on the hospital. Yet the demonstrations that resulted from that, the condemnation that resulted from that, all the rest of this was really very, very damaging. And that lingers. And it feeds a narrative that is put forward by those that, again, is very hard on Israel in that regard. So the information space, I think you're exactly right. I don't know that Gerasimov's original concept of hybrid warfare completely works, though, and at the very least, the Russians haven't fared too well in this war. He is the chief of the general staff, and I think he has to own a bit of that himself.
Do totalitarian regimes that can control the media and information have a strategic advantage over places like the United States with more openness?
Yes, at the beginning, but it's a bit like surprise attacks. You know, they're better at launching surprise attacks, but in the long run, actually democracies do much better because they tend to be believed. You know that Hamas and the health authorities in Palestine who work for Hamas, I think later on in this campaign are simply not going to be believed with the numbers that they're likely to put forward for the number of civilians killed and wounded, because they are essentially an authoritarian stroke totalitarian organization.
Remember Baghdad Bob, as we were closing in on Baghdad Bob is transmitting there in Iraq's capital. It's all going great.
Yeah.
We're kicking the Americans' butt.
They're
It's
coming
all,
into our trap.
They're approaching our trap. It's all going to be fine, people. And of course, he was one of the ones who fled very quickly thereafter.
Wasn't Baghdad Bob in the first one and the second one? Or did
I think
have that
that's
wrong?
right. Yeah. Yep.
Where is
Next
he
question,
now?
please.
Do you know
Right
where
there.
he is now?
Yeah.
Is there such thing as a limited warfare anymore? Seems like everybody.
Well, all warfare is limited in the sense that we haven't had escalation to nuclear weapons use. So in that regard, definitionally, it's all limited. It's carried out under not the umbrella of nuclear deterrence, but under the umbrella of the threat of nuclear weapons use. And hopefully, we won't see all-out war. Hopefully, it will stay limited, given the extraordinary destructive potential of, particularly of strategic nuclear weapons. Next question, please. I thought we saw it right here, and then there's one over there. Okay, and then bring it up to the front over here, if you would.
So you mentioned in relation to Vietnam how the corruption, was part of the South Vietnamese government, and that just started me thinking, particularly, where there are these conflicts where there are, large international or larger countries funding smaller forces, throwing millions, billions of dollars at them. I think there's a perception that, at least in the media, that was a problem with Iraq, that there was a lot of corruption and a lot of money didn't get spent. Is that, and we get the impression that in Ukraine, we're putting billions of dollars in there. I don't know if the Ukrainian people are just more virtuous, but you don't hear about corruption as opposed to the Russian side. So is there a way that we can,
Yeah, there is.
how does that affect warfare?
First of all, in Afghanistan, I think it was probably worse because it was a very poor country, and yet we were bringing in very substantial amounts of money for construction projects, nation building, and all the rest. And in a way, the time pressures that I felt as a commander and that others felt were so considerable that we tended to err on the side of push it really fast because we might not have this next year. In fact, we won't have it next year. We won't have the troops next year. So let's get it done while we can. And eventually we did create anti-corruption task forces, one just for the entire security industry. There was a whole industry that secured Western convoys and all the rest of this. There was another one that was a U.S. and Afghan joint effort, and we made real progress. In fact, Brigadier General H.R. McMaster, I brought him in to head that and to establish it. We took down the Chief of Staff of the Air Force of Afghanistan. We took down the Surgeon General. We took down the commander of the military hospital. The problem is that it was so endemic and it was so difficult to track. And again, we were always under time pressure, which meant you push stuff. And sometimes we had the wrong big ideas. The big idea in construction should have been use Afghan design, Afghan construction materials, Afghan workers. But it would take longer. It wasn't going to be quite to the quality, and we tended to default to Western stuff that was more difficult for them to maintain. It usually required environmental control units given the extremes of the weather. So again, all of this, you put your finger on something. I believe we have learned lessons from that. And when it comes to Ukraine, there's an entire team that I've met with twice in the last 4 months that does nothing but track the sensitive weapon systems. There's a lot of very, very high-tech weaponry, especially when it comes to the air defense systems and the anti-tank guided missile systems. They're serial numbered. And you can track that nowadays with a cell phone and the internet in a variety of different ways. So they're focusing a lot on that. And then there's another whole team that's doing nothing but tracking the money. There will still be corruption. Inevitably, Ukraine had a problem with corruption. But I asked the president when I met with him 4 months ago, I said, I want to ask questions not based as a former general, but as a current partner in one of the world's biggest investment firms, KKR, $520 billion under management. We've never seen Ukraine as an investment destination, and here's why. Inadequate rule of law, corruption, monopolistic powers in certain sectors by certain oligarchs, et cetera, et cetera. What are you doing to address those? And he went through chapter and verse on each one of those. Which is why we often note that he's not just focused on winning the war, he's trying to figure out how to win the peace. Whenever this is resolved, whatever the lines are when it's resolved, and when he's working on trying to get not just funding from states for reconstruction, a Marshall-like reconstruction plan, it's also about getting private enterprise, private investment in there. That is the key to their future development. And he knows what they need to do for that, the question is, can he truly institutionalize it, make it enduring? I think it's possible. I don't think it is mission impossible, but it will take a lot of determination. But he's focused on it. So that's one of the reasons I think you hear less about it, although there are allegations about it, and those that aren't disposed to continuing to support Ukraine, which I think is absolutely in our national security interest, will be more prone to emphasize that rather than the importance of continuing to support. But no, we had problems. Iraq has a lot of corruption in and of itself. The huge difference between Iraq and Afghanistan. They can generate $100 billion of oil revenue. Afghanistan could generate maybe $500 million of taxes and tariffs or something like that, customs duties. So very, very different scale. We were probably the source of the challenges in Afghanistan more actually than we were in Iraq, which had its own money and its own problems. These are, this is difficult stuff, and you don't get to choose the partners all the time. You go to war with the partner you get, not with the partner you'd like. Sometimes it's fantastic, not always.
This has been a terrific discussion, gentlemen. Thank you. And General Petraeus, I was proud to serve under you in Afghanistan. It was Christmas Eve 2010. I met you briefly. So
Fantastic.
you get at Fob Shank.
So on.
I was hoping to explore China a little bit for the next few moments with you, gentlemen. And I know we're looking at the larger arc of history since World War II. If we back that left bookend up a little bit to the interwar years between World War I and World War II, you see parallels there and kind of a ramp up for a conflict. And looking back now 20 years later, would you say that our coin operations in Iraq and Afghanistan kind of sidetracked us from that larger strategic battle with China?
I mean, I guess with hindsight, it's indisputable, except that we weren't operating with hindsight. At that time, the most important threat to the United States in the wake of the 9/11 attacks was the extremist group that carried them out. I mean, you can certainly argue about the decision to invade Iraq, and a lot of people have. And there's one question I will never address, and that's whether we should or should not have gone into Iraq. And it's strictly because I wrote more letters of condolence to America's mothers and fathers than any other commander. And I think that's something to leave to the historians and the pundits and others to debate. Clearly, we were very heavily invested in those. I mean, at one point in time during the surge in Iraq, we had everything that our military could deploy, either deployed or recovering and about to deploy again. But I think fairly early on, it was while I was still in uniform, and then when I was the director of the CIA, the idea of the rebalance to Asia was conceived. I thought it was the sound strategy for the future. We did draw down our forces successfully in Iraq, actually reasonably successfully in Afghanistan until we lacked the strategic patience to continue. A lot of people will say, in 20 years, oh my gosh, we've had troops in Korea since obviously actually even before the 1950s, but tens of thousands of them. We still have 30,000 or more troops in Japan. And no one really is concerned about that as long as you're not taking casualties and the expense is not prohibitive and it makes sense strategically, that's fine. I personally think that the U.S. can keep all the plates spinning, if you will, to use that metaphor of the guy in the circus, together with allies and partners, foremost among them, the one represented by Lord Roberts. It is doable, and I think it's actually important that we do it. I think it's in our national interest, again, that we do everything we can, together with allies and partners, to preserve the rules-based international order that the U.S. and U.K. and others established in the wake of a 50-year period that saw 2 horrific world wars and the Great Recession. And it generally has served the world reasonably well. There are countries that don't want to see it continue for their own interests, and I think we should try to ensure that it does. And we can do all of this. This is not beyond our means. Because you support Ukraine doesn't mean that you can't also improve security in our southern border or fund FEMA or help Taiwan or Israel or whatever. I think, again, this is all within our capacity. The key is, again, the strategic leader does have to decide on that, make the case to the American people. That's not always done perhaps as effectively as it might be. And then, of course, oversee that implementation. So, again, you see this wonderful strategic leadership model in action. But clearly, the main focus, even with the effort to support Israel, which we fully support, and to continue to support Ukraine, is about deterring and making sure that what's described as severe competition, the relationship between the U.S. and China, and also the West and China, does not erupt into conflict. And we have agency here. We have to ensure that deterrence is solid. It's a factor of, there's 2 factors. It's a product of those. It's the potential adversary's assessment of your capabilities on the one hand, and your willingness to employ them on the other. And we have to ensure there's no doubt about those at all, without being needlessly provocative. We need to be very firm, but not, again, foolishly or needlessly provocative. We just need to make sure that every morning when the sun comes up in Beijing and the leaders get up, that they look out there and they say, okay, not today. And we just keep them saying not today until new leaders or new relationship or new recognition that it might just be better to have the most mutually beneficial relationship that's possible.
It is one of the major takeaways from this book, that deterrence, though immensely expensive, and especially true, of course, with regard to China, which would dearly love to muscle the Americans out of Southeast Asia, nonetheless, that if you put enough money into deterrence, it's almost always money extremely well spent, because the cost of the alternative, war, is always so much more.
I remember that line. I underlined it because it was fantastic to read. It was really, I appreciated it, especially reading this book. I guess we're about out of time. I'll ask you all one question. You always want to end on a high note, so I don't know how this is going to go, this question. So this book spans the globe. It's really a remarkable tour de force of the history of warfare from World War II to the present. And one of the key themes, there are a number of them, we've hit on a lot of them, but one of them is the surprise attacks are surprisingly common. So when you think about the future, and I don't want to play the game of guess where it's going to happen next, but when you think about the future, do you feel confident that the Western world, at least, is going to be able to respond to that surprise attack?
I personally do, owing to the fact that although this Hamas attack was a surprise attack, again and again in history, these are things that are unleashed by authoritarian and totalitarian powers. And you're quite right about how often they happen. Paul Wolfowitz said that there are surprise attacks happen so often in history that the surprising thing is we're still surprised by them. And we shouldn't be. But what they also do is to light a sort of moral fury in the hearts of those who have been surprised and taken by surprise. And it tends almost always to wind up being a mistake for the surprise attacker. You see it so often in history. We go into it time and again in this book. And so that is, if we're looking for uplifting things about conflict. I think that is one of them.
No, I very much support that. I think actually the issue that could give you pause is that which is going to be the subject of your next conference, which is the state of democracy in America. We have obviously faced some significant challenges, some unprecedented developments, and if the House of Representatives can get its act together, though, and perhaps even conduct some bipartisan legislation, I'm very confident that we can. But I think actually arguably the biggest challenge that is out there is an internal challenge here in the United States. Because, again, the U.S. has a unique role in the world. As Madeleine Albright said, the indispensable nation. I believe we need to continue that role. But obviously you can't do that if there is such dysfunction in the congressional branch, the legislative branch of our government, that you can't even provide appropriations and authorizations.
Maybe they all should follow that indispensable man.
That'd be a good idea.
Yeah. Thank you all for coming. There are books available for sale at the back, and I hope to see you all next Thursday. Thank you. Thank you.
Very much. Thank you. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks.